To begin, I want to introduce Nancy Ankrum, an LA board member and the editorial page editor of the Miami Herald, who will be moderating today's discussion. Nancy's bio says it's all about sunshine and palm trees in Miami for her. So we think it's quite fitting she's leading the Sunshine Week discussion today. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, Nancy. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Fran. Well, at the same time that I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate Sunshine Week and the First Amendment, it really pains me, and I'm sure just about everyone watching, that we are all really in a battle to save those guaranteed rights. Yeah, I'm in Florida, sunshine and palm trees, but this state also used to be a beacon of sunshine, of transparency, and of public access. But now, 30 years later, we have almost 1,200 exemptions to the Sunshine Law. And now that the legislature is currently in session, there are more to come. That said, I would like everyone to welcome our panelists. They all have such valuable information to impart. We'll be hearing from Derek Kravitz from the Brown Institute in New York, David Snyder, the First Amendment Coalition, and Andrea Gallo of The Advocate in Louisiana. And Derek, I'd like you to kick it off with your stories of documenting COVID-19 and the data that accompanied the pandemic. And if you could just introduce yourself and what the Institute does before you launch into your experiences.
Yep. Thanks, Nancy. I appreciate it. My name is Derek. I work at the Brown Institute, which is a nonprofit journalism think tank housed at Columbia University and also Stanford. We work with journalism students and data science and computer science students across both institutions, basically to figure out how to work with messy relational data sets or documents and try to make it easier for newsrooms and others to use. So for the past year, we've been working on COVID-related projects, just like many newsrooms. And I just want to talk a little bit about documenting COVID, which is a project we started in March 2020 to basically house Foia materials and to push and fight for public records at the local level. So I'm going to share my screen really quick, see if this works. Maybe. Looks like a host has disabled. Oh, now I'm a co-host. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. And we'll all make this quick, but.
Can I get a guide for you?
Yes. Can I get a venti peppermint mocha, non-fat, extra?
I think I hear someone making a Starbucks order.
I just muted her. Okay.
Yeah. But I'll be quick on this. So documenting COVID, public records repository, 250 record sets that we've published. These are the most newsworthy record sets that we found. We've actually put in 3,000 FOIA requests I've totaled, and we have about 500 in our Google Drive that we share with partner newsrooms, but we found 250 are the most meaningful. We've compiled these from 44 different states and territories. We've worked on 70 investigative stories with partners since March. Our project team is made up of Columbia journalism and data science researchers funded through a magic grant at the Brown Institute, which is a once a year big grant that they give out to 5 or 10 different projects. Our mission is to obtain internal emails, memos, health metrics, a lot of basically important public health information from local health departments, state health departments, governor's offices, any public body that is making decisions about the virus. I just want to very briefly step back and just note that FOIA is basically messy relational data. I worked at ProPublica for 3 years as director of research, and during that time we worked on a lot of stories about the Trump administration. We launched an app called Trumptown. We did these 2 projects about undocumented separation of children at the border, and lost mothers, maternal mortality. And so all those projects were basically very messy relational data that we obtained through Foia. And so that's all to say that these projects can take many different forms, not just pandemic related.
Derek, can I just interrupt a minute? What does relational mean?
By relational, I mean you're pulling from different sources. So say you FOIA one agency and you get one bit of information, a memo or email chain. That's one bit of information, but in sort of explaining what's going on with that county or with that state, you have to pull from multiple sources. So you're relating 5 or 6 different sources into one cohesive sort of either document set or in some cases stories or projects.
Thank you.
So this is just briefly about the project and the impact and what we do. 3 of our stories that we've worked on with local outlets basically got classified outbreak or epidemiological data from Illinois, Kansas, and North Carolina. These were very simple requests. But we found that if we just asked for the information, that a lot of states would provide it. And that resulted in those states actually changing their policies and proactively posting information about locations where outbreaks were happening. And this was in the spring and the summer when things were mostly tied to specific workplaces or outbreaks. Our process is very basic and similar to a lot of newsrooms. We just target a specific agency or a person, and we ask for the records and tailor our requests as a result. And when we get those records back, we review them, do doc review, and summarize them and put them in story form and reach out to partners. One thing that's really useful with this type of work is collaboration. A lot of times we're in New York, we're a lot of students involved in this project. We don't have people on the ground in every state. So we need to partner with local newsrooms, and it benefits their audience too. So we've partnered now with 30 different newsrooms, big guys like the New York Times and the Washington Post and ProPublica, and smaller organizations like Cal Matters and the Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting. And the Detroit Free Press. And so we found that those are the most meaningful stories when you can collaborate with 2 or 3, or in some cases 4 different partners in compiling information. I just want to very quickly go over, I've been on 3 or 4 Sunshine Week panels this week, and there are like a laundry list of questions about what works and what doesn't work with Foia. So I just want to like highlight these and then I'll be done. Just a reminder, most FOIA denials are because of just 2 exemptions, and trade secrets are being cited more and more, so just be mindful of that. Less than 1/3 of FOIAs are fully granted. FOIA requests are surging even though funding is not. The agencies that are getting FOIA'd the most have the worst response rates, and that's not surprising. And journalists make up a relatively small share of FOIA requesters. There's businesses and law firms and other groups that are requesting. So just knowing the landscape is important. So these 9 to-dos are really key and valuable when you're making your request. Check the morgue, check the reading rooms, file a FOIA of other FOIAs, create a template, nudge your request, make sure that you're checking in on those periodically. Be very clear and specific in your language. I note that be like an EPA requester. EPA requesters are the best because they know exactly what they're looking for, and they include tracking numbers and other information about specific documents or data sets that they're looking for. Use a date range, ask for documents and data, get simple track processing, request expedited processing, appeal, etc. These are all things that just keep in mind as you request. And the last thing is, I think templates are very useful, but make sure that what you're asking for is very clear and orderly, and treat it like you would any other sort of important document. Even put it on a letterhead, and just be mindful as to what you're requesting. That's it.
Derek, one of your slides said that less than 1/3, or maybe only 1/3 of FOIA requests are fully granted. Does that represent deterioration, or is that standard? What are you relating? What can we relate that to? Are things getting worse?
So the caveat with that is that's federal FOIA, not state, and but that's by and large that's what you see across the country. What we found is that a lot of requests are partially granted, so you'll get some information with redactions. Sometimes it's useful to ask for a redaction log and a Vaughn index, they call it, and get more information about what's being withheld and appeal those if you can. Basically, because of funding, FOIA can be interpreted as an unfunded mandate in a lot of places. And depending on how certain agencies are actually funded and actually dealing with the pandemic, a lot of places will say we can't deal with this right now. We're in a public health crisis. So just reminding them that this is codified in state statute or federal, and that it's important to comply with the law, and in some cases getting a good government group or an attorney to write a sharply worded letter is very useful.
What advice do you have for freelance writers, citizen bloggers, those who might file a FOIA request? They're seeking information, but they also do not have an institution. They do not have a newspaper. They do not have any kind of relatively moneyed news organization behind them.
We have a lot of students at Columbia that are basically on their own. In fact, are listed as students at Columbia, and that's usually a knock against them when they're dealing with PIOs or other offices. And so in a lot of cases, they treat it like they would, just their beat. They call the FOIA officer beforehand, introduce themselves, explain who they are, what stories they've worked on. In their FOIA request, they include a paragraph about themselves. They have their name, maybe their website or their Twitter handle or what have you, and they include places where they've published. They just over-explain in some cases that they are a journalist. They're working on a story that will be published, even if they don't have the publication outlet in mind. And this is something that will be used for either dissemination to other newsrooms or their own story, and they need to treat it like a normal news request. So just again, being very deliberate and explicit with that is usually helpful.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now ask David Snyder of the First Amendment Coalition to address the audience.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm David Snyder. I'm the executive director of the First Amendment Coalition. And we're a nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we focus on defending, protecting, and promoting the right of free speech and the right of the people to see what their government's doing, or put another way, the right of the people and reporters to get government records and to see government meetings. And so we spend our days helping reporters and others get access to records and meetings. And boy, did we see some interesting stuff in 2020. We run a free legal hotline, and we just got a flood of calls and emails about open government problems. Many of them stemming ultimately from the pandemic. We got a record high number of inquiries in many months, which tells you how bad things got. So I just want to talk briefly about the problems we've seen that are kind of pandemic related, and then also solutions or approaches that reporters and others can take in order to try to overcome those problems. The pandemic presented kind of an interesting case study in how governments treat the laws governing public access, and too often really how they mistreat these laws. So just briefly, every state has its own public records law. There's the federal FOIA law. My organization deals with FOIA, and we deal primarily with the California Public Records Act, but every state has its own regime. But I think you can draw some generalizations based on what we've seen. And so one thing you hear again and again about the pandemic is that many aspects of our society, many problems underlying our society have been aggravated and sort of highlighted. Systemic existing problems like racial inequity, economic inequity, educational inequities, the pandemic has really thrown those into sharp relief. And I think access to public records is no exception to this rule. Agencies that may have treated public records laws not so seriously before the pandemic sort of went into full-on scofflaw mode, full-on obstructive mode. And the terrible irony of this is that knowledge about how the government's doing what it's doing was so much more crucial, has been so much more crucial during the pandemic, because government has been exercising extraordinary powers at the local, state, and federal level. Shutdown orders, mask mandates, businesses are having to close. And so people have a right and really a need to see inside their local, state, federal government and understand how it's working. And yet, because of the pandemic, all too often we saw government agencies responding in ways that fell far short of what public records laws require. So just briefly, some of the things that we saw a lot of. One is, we saw this mostly at the beginning of the pandemic, although we're still seeing it to some degree. And that's basically a response to a public records request that says, there's a pandemic on, come back later. We'll handle your issue later. In essence, sort of arbitrarily suspending the time deadlines that public records laws require. And the short answer to that, at least in almost every state, is no, the law is still in effect. You don't get to just set it aside because you're busy. Another response that we saw was agencies indefinitely delaying their responses. So providing you, for example, with a response saying, we received your request, we'll be handling it, but who knows when we'll get back to you. Another problematic thing we saw was agencies delaying in responding so long that by the time it came around time to actually get the records and provide them to the requester, they'd already been destroyed because of what are called record retention laws. So many jurisdictions have, not laws, record retention schedules. They have charts basically that say these type of records will be destroyed in 6 months. These will be destroyed in 2 months. And so they, delay and delay and delay. And by the time, we got it, guess what? Those records are already gone. They've been destroyed. And that's a problem. On the open meetings front, one persistent problem we've seen is agencies not letting the public speak directly to their elected representatives in a public meeting, but rather requiring them to submit comments by email and often requiring them to do so 24 hours in advance. Many agencies, it took a little while, but many agencies moved over to Zoom and have successfully been able to conduct public meetings by Zoom. And many agencies have figured out a way to let the public address the legislative body by way of Zoom. It's not rocket science, you can do it. But many agencies, on the other hand, have taken the opportunity to sort of stop that live public comment and require people to submit requests submit public comment in writing. And at least in California, that is not consistent with the state's open meetings laws. And so we've been reminding people, agencies, of that at every opportunity. On a broader level, many states suspended the deadlines for responding to their open records laws given the pandemic. And one state, at least, that was Hawaii, suspended the open records law entirely, although I think it was relatively brief. So a number of states suspended the deadlines. Many did not, and California, where we're located, did not suspend any of the requirements of the California Public Records Act. And we've been, as I said, we've been reminding agencies, we've been telling anybody who will listen that the law still applies. You still have to follow the law, agency. And then finally, we got a lot of kind of blanket denials for records, especially those relating to COVID, based on HIPAA, the federal medical privacy law. And occasionally that law legitimately applies to prevent the release of some or all of the records that folks are requesting. But many, many times agencies just use this as a kind of magic amulet to say, we can't give you those records. They're medical related. And so HIPAA, HIPAA, HIPAA. And that often that kind of blanket response is just improper. So what do you do? What does a reporter do in order to overcome these problems? The first one is, just to be blunt about it, be a kind of pain in the ass. You have to be persistent, polite but persistent. Keep a calendar. Make sure that you know when the agency is supposed to respond. And if they don't respond, follow up immediately. And it's just really important, especially given the problems that we've seen with the pandemic, that you approach these requests methodically and persistently. We put up a sample letter on our website to help reporters and others respond to this agency response that we saw a lot of at the beginning of the pandemic, which was, we can't respond to you now, everyone's too busy. Well, that's not appropriate. And we have a kind of sample letter. It's under California law, but I think could be applied more broadly in many instances, that says that's improper. The law still applies. Be resourceful. So think about other agencies that may have the same or similar records that you're seeking. If you're getting pushback from one agency, try to go around them. And call on groups like mine to help craft a letter or to just give you some basic advice about what the law says and what the law requires. It can be helpful, although it shouldn't be required and is not required, to understand the nature of the exemptions of whatever law that you're working under, so that you can, not so that you can not request records. I always encourage reporters and others to not limit their request based on what they know about the exemptions, but in order to push back against an agency that is citing exemptions and maybe citing them improperly. So that's a kind of short list of things that you can do, and a broad overview of the issues that we saw.
David, Dick Rogers has a question for you. He wants to know about what you've heard, what you've experienced in terms of problems with accessing court records, court access. Yeah,
that's a great question, because court records fall under a different access regime than agency records. And access to court records, I'll talk about California because that's what I know best. Access to court records has been problematic. So there are generally two ways that you can get court records, that is, records that are actually filed in a case in court. One is to walk into the courthouse, talk to the clerk, look at the terminal there inside the courthouse and ask for those records. Well, that mode of access was largely closed off, or at least limited during the pandemic, because courthouses were not as open for physical access as they have traditionally been. And my organization actually filed a federal lawsuit in Kern County, California, because that court was not providing adequate access to court proceedings. And we were able to resolve that. But if you can't get into the courthouse, or you can't get in a way that allows you to get the records, you're blocked there. The other way to access records is online. And if you're looking in federal court, you can use the PACER system, and that has its problems, but at least it's consistent, and at least it has relatively low fees. In California, there's very little consistency. The way you can access records online, or even if you can access records online, varies greatly depending on whether you're in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Modoc County, far in the north. And the fees for getting those records can also be great, can be high, far too high. So what do? If you can't get into the court and you can't find it online, what I would recommend is trying to contact somebody in the clerk's office by phone or by email and tell them what you're looking for, either in the clerk's office or if the court has a public information officer. They should be able and willing to help you get the records that you need. We're seeing courthouses opening up more, so physical access is, I think, easier certainly than it was a year ago. But if you need records remotely and you can't get them online, do the old-fashioned, get on the phone, because folks are entitled to any records that have been filed in a proceeding. That's a First Amendment right, actually. And so if records have been filed in court, you should be able to get them. How you carry that access right out as a practical matter really depends on the specific court and the circumstances, but the telephone can be a great resource.
David, thank you very, very much. We're going to hear from Andrea Gallo now of Louisiana, who has what turned out to be a good news story, but what led up to it will just curl your toes. Andrea?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm Andrea Gallo, and I'm an investigative reporter for The Advocate and the Times-Picayune in Louisiana. So the story I am going to tell to you today goes back to December. I filed a public records request under the Louisiana Public Records Act, which is pretty open, guarantees us quite a few records in Louisiana. And I filed it with the Louisiana Attorney General's office about an employee who had been placed on administrative leave named Pat McGee. And he's a top deputy in the office, the head of the criminal division for the Attorney General's office. So when I initially filed the request, the Attorney General's office told me that they would get the records to me once the investigation into Mr. McGee had been completed. And I said, okay, and I waited for the investigation to finish. And then come January, Andrea, we find out.
Let me interrupt. Why was Mr. McGee being investigated?
The AG's office didn't release a lot of information about it to begin with. But we knew a complaint had been filed against him. And so we requested complaints, particularly sexual harassment complaints, because they seemed like the most obvious. And so come January, he is back at work and we say, clearly the investigation is finished. Can we please have the records that we requested? And the AG's office went back and forth with us for a couple of weeks saying, we're working on it, we'll get them to you. And then on a Friday afternoon, they sent me a new response saying that not only would they not be releasing the records, they were also suing me personally over the public records request. And so, so we went to court, and the Advocate's attorney luckily represented me. I mean, the paper has really stepped in to represent me during all of this, even though the lawsuit was against me in my personal capacity and not against the newspaper in general. And so we had a hearing about 2 weeks ago, and luckily the judge ruled that the records needed to be released publicly, and he assessed attorney's fees and court costs so that the Attorney General has to pay for all of the costs of the proceeding and our attorney's fees. And so after the hearing, the AG's office released the records into Mr. McGee, which were extremely alarming. They showed that several women had complained about his behavior in the office. He had been accused of saying that one woman was too beautiful to promote, and he was worried about controlling himself sexually around her. He was also accused of trying to put another attorney into a court hearing because he thought that male jurors would want to have sex with her. There was another woman who said that he repeatedly told her that she was no longer as beautiful as she used to be. And so we got the records and we reported on them. And the kind of interesting aspect of this too is that the AG's office found during their investigation that none of this rose to the level of sexual harassment. And so we reported on it. And then shortly after we reported on it, I heard from another woman who had filed a new complaint with the AG's office about the same man. And so she spoke to me, and in between the time that I was like going to publish her story, I reached out to the AG's office seeking comment, and to Mr. McGee, as we always do. And he resigned shortly before we published the second story. So the story about his resignation ended up having this new detail about a new complaint being filed against him as well. So that's where we are today. And there's still going to be another court event in this whole process, because whenever the AG sued me, it was specifically over me requesting this complaint. And that is what the judge like took up during a kind of limited ruling. But in our reconventional demand, we said that we also wanted the records of how the complaints were handled, since the AG's office insisted that none of this rose to the level of sexual harassment. And we still haven't received those records yet, like figuring out kind of what happened during this investigation. And so that is likely to be the subject of a future court hearing.
I'm just speechless, almost. Did the advocate cover your trial? Was it transparent about what the AG had done targeting you specifically? Was that a story?
Yes, so I did not cover my own trial because we felt that that would be a conflict of interest. So my editor covered both when the lawsuit was filed, the trial, and a few developments in between. Like there were several kind of good government groups that came out against all of this. There was a lot of national attention. So he covered those related developments along the way. And our editorial board very strongly editorialized on this, and actually urged people to file their own request with the AG's office for the same records that I had requested, which was a lot of fun.
Torst Dumo asks, what was the legal rationale for targeting you as opposed to the newspaper?
I don't really know. I guess that might be more of a question for an attorney. So since I was the requester, I guess that in some capacity my name had to be on this, but it was kind of strange looking at the court filings, because they didn't even really reference that I was a reporter for a newspaper. Like, they just referred to me as a legal age adult living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So it kind of makes you wonder if this is the sort of approach that the AG would take for any regular citizen who filed a records request.
The AG has said nothing up to now about this strategy that he took. Has said nothing about even Mr. McGee, who eventually resigned, nothing about allowing him to stay, even though the evidence in the investigation showed horrific behavior.
Over the past few days, the Attorney General has gone on a bit of a media tour, though not with my newspaper, with other outlets, defending his handling of all of this. And he's kind of tried over and over again to frame this not as a direct lawsuit against me, but he keeps using the phrase looking to the courts. The Attorney General's office was purely looking to the courts for guidance on how to handle this request, is the way that he has tried to frame the narrative of all of this. And this past week, you know, he said that they care deeply about sexual harassment and they want to root it out of the office. But at the same time, he continues very much to defend the lawsuit against me.
You're getting just a lot of love in the chat room. Bravo. Just wow. Way to go, Andrea. And the advocate. That's from Sherry Wickwire. And I have to second, you know, bravo, bravo. It's like I said, I'm just speechless. I'm just speechless. I'm also amazed that that didn't happen in Florida. There's just a ring of, wow, we haven't done that here. Do you know if there's precedent for suing the requester, the person making the request, at a newspaper, at a news outlet directly?
Unfortunately, I think that there is. There's another case in Louisiana involving another newspaper in the northern part of the state that has been dragged into court over their requests of some, I think, court records. And that case has been ongoing for quite a while now. And then once this came out, we heard a lot from people who study Foia and First Amendment issues all across the country. And they said that this is part of this kind of new and disturbing trend that they call reverse Foia lawsuits against requesters. So I think that it's, unfortunately, it does have precedent.
Yeah, Nancy, I could speak to that if you
Please.
wanted. I know, yeah. So as Andrea said, reverse Public Records Act or reverse FOIA lawsuits they're a thing, unfortunately, and they probably are on the rise, although I haven't seen hard numbers to sort of verify that. In California, at least, it wasn't really even clear under California law that this kind of a lawsuit was possible until the Court of Appeal decided that it was about 10 years ago. And since that Court of Appeal decision, we have seen a growing number of them. And the way they typically are set up is that a third party who has some interest in the records, the person who is at issue, for example, in complaints about sexual misconduct, will go into court. I guess most of the time they're technically suing the government agency. They're asking a judge to prevent the government agency from releasing the records.
Right.
But on occasion, the requester themselves can be dragged into the lawsuit. And that's where it becomes really problematic, because what that can mean is that an individual who did nothing but submit a Public Records Act request or a FOIA request is dragged into court. And do they get a lawyer? Do they pay for the lawyer? You know, that's a problem. I think whether these things are possible varies state by state. And under FOIA, the federal FOIA law, reverse FOIA lawsuits are possible. They're limited, I think, in the harm they can do, because there's a very specific procedure for these that FOIA lays out. In other places like California, which I know best, there aren't clear guidelines on how these things work. And so it's a little bit Wild West. Requester, an agency can be sued. The requester possibly could be sued as well. Mm-hmm. But the overall public interest harm here is that it puts the requester to the burden of sort of proving why the records should be public, even though they weren't the one who asked to be in court in the first place. Sure. So they're tasked with getting a lawyer and figuring, whereas the way it's supposed to go is it's the requester who steers the ship. The requester is typically the one who gets to choose when to go into court. So they're a problem. They're a problem broadly.
Right.
And I should say, since David mentioned the kind of state by state differences on this, Louisiana has a relatively new law. Initially, I think the legislature considered banning these suits in their entirety, and they got some pushback, and I'm not sure what happened. So instead, they passed a law a few years ago saying that if you are sued in the course of requesting public records and you prevail in the lawsuit, then you are automatically owed attorney's fees and court costs. So that that law kind of helped us, you know, in this case to recover those costs.
Right. Ed Burke informs us that the Florida legislature is considering a bill that would prohibit records custodians from suing requesters, even for a simple declaratory judgment, whether a record should be released. Edward should know I just cut and pasted his comment, and the Miami Herald editorial board's going to look into that one. Thank you very, very much. I would like, I'd like all of the panelists to address something that Andrea actually brought up. You said, Andrea, that your paper just supported you 100%, including the editorial board requesting that citizens file their own requests, that there was a call to action, there was community engagement here. My question is this, you know, when we run our Sunshine Week editorials and op-eds and whatnot, I always fear that our readers, that, you know, local residents see that as, well, it's just a problem that the media is having, and that they don't understand that we are doing this, the media do this on their behalf, that we are doing this as representatives of the general public. How should journalists, how should all sorts of media outlets engage citizens to really let them know that this is about them and that this really needs to matter to them? As a matter of fact, I mean, there are tons of citizens who run into some of the very same roadblocks that media outlets do in trying to get records and trying to get documents. Who can answer that? I hope all of you.
I can take a stab at it, Nancy. Yeah, so how do you convince the general public, the non-journalists, the civilians, that transparency, government transparency is important? I think one way is to point to examples of what happens when there's not transparency. So to point, in California, one example would be the small city of Bell just became a den of corruption and self-dealing about 10 years ago. And the city manager and the mayor were colluding to give each other like $500,000 salaries. And this went on for years until the LA Times sort of found out about it and looked into it. And so you can point to examples like that and say, when there is no transparency, self-dealing almost necessarily occurs. And that's detrimental to everyone that lives in the jurisdiction at issue. You can even, I think, point to examples more broadly, national examples, and say, for example, you know, if there's a decent chance that if there'd been greater transparency in the Minneapolis Police Department, that we, you know, the public and the police department had known about Derek Chauvin problems that he'd had before, we may not have even seen the murder of George Floyd. That those kind of problems come up when there is no transparency. And so transparency is a crucial kind of corrective, a crucial health check, if you will, on local, state, federal government, so that the large problems don't develop. And it can be a difficult sell because, you know, it's not as immediately gripping as the problems themselves when they explode into public view. But a healthily functioning democracy at whatever level you're talking about has to have transparency, because problems fester. Problematic police officers, government officials who are serial sexual harassers, those kind of things. Andrea's case is a perfect example. Like the guy didn't resign until it became fully public. You know, if that information had been public 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there would have been all that, you know, the number of women who would be harassed by this guy would have been reduced substantially. And thankfully it became public. But if you can sort of sell the case that if we'd known about this earlier, this guy wouldn't have been there to cause the harm that he caused.
Yeah, yeah. Derek? Like
Yeah, just to echo what David was saying, you know, individual stories like Andrea's, you know, are visceral and have a lot of impact because people can relate, and they also shed light on, you know, systemic or other issues that maybe haven't got the attention that they deserve. One thing we found with all of our FOIA requests, we're doing a push now for variant information in New York and New Jersey, because those are areas where the variants are circulating, and we're having a plateauing or even a slight increase in cases and deaths here. And one thing we found is when we frame stories with, you know, people and stories and engage, you know, do community engagement with an eye towards you know, having people submit their stories, or engaging with Google Forms or Screen Door or other opportunities for people to write in with what they're hearing and seeing, that increases the both the lifespan of the story, but also gives an opportunity for second or third or fourth day stories for all these things. And so when we, you know, we want to write about the variants, but we found that, you know, no one is interested in just a variant story. They want to know about the two nurses in a small borough near Paterson, New Jersey, who got reinfected with the virus after getting the second dose of the vaccine, and probably have a variant, but haven't gotten that genomic sequencing in order to determine what variant they got. That's a story that will lead the day, and that will get published. So just, you know, again, talking in those terms and framing stories that way usually helps.
Right, I see. Andrea, is there something that your newspaper or other newspapers, other media outlets can do to even build upon what your paper already did in this case?
I would just say that the outpouring of reader interest in all of this was massive. I mean, we were really, we figured people would care, but I was shocked at how many kind of random friends and acquaintances of mine were messaging me and saying, like, I'm gonna file my first ever public records request because I read about this thing, and, you know, I wanna do it too. So I think that it really kind of helped energize people and their interest in public records and these issues. So, you know, I would say that's definitely one great thing that came out of this lawsuit, was just to see that people who had never filed a public records request before suddenly were kind of learning how to do it and thinking to themselves, you know, what sort of information might I want to request in the future?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Have you heard from any of them? Did they get any response at all?
Yes, I heard from quite a few of them. So while the lawsuit was pending, they all got similar responses, not in the sense that they got sued, but they got similar responses saying, we will not release these records because right of privacy, et cetera, et cetera. Ever since the suit, though, and since the records are released, I'm not sure if the AG's office has personally gone back to any of them and sent them the complaint that the court gave to us. I don't think that any of them have gotten that, but maybe they will.
Sure. Paul Boylan asks, this is for you, Andrea. It says that Louisiana has a strong anti-SLAPP law. And I can't remember what SLAPP means, but I know what it is. It's yes, what happened to you really, to sue and subdue the requester, the complainer, you name it. Did your attorney move to strike this lawsuit as a SLAPP at all?
We do have a strong anti-SLAPP law. I don't believe that we have invoked it in terms of this, because I think that our response to the suit was essentially saying, like, we're going to explain, first of all, why this suit is wrong, and secondly, why we want these records, as opposed to straight up spiking the suit from the courts. But that might be more of a question for our lawyer, Scott Sternberg, than for me.
Sure. On that note, I would like to encourage everyone watching to go to, I think it's sunshineweek.org. It's NLA Sunshine Week website. There are two op-eds, and one is from Florida, and a woman named Maggie Herchala, who happens to be Janet Reno's sister. But she is a very ardent environmentalist in Central Florida. And she was slapped for speaking out against, I think it was a rock mining, I think, in her community. And she was slapped and she lost. She lost with a $4 million judgment against her, which still stands. It went up the chain, and the appeals courts did not challenge it. It's just a chilling story, and she tells her story really well at sunshineweek.org. Rachel, if I have if I have the incorrect website, you can let me know and I'll correct it. Oh, here's what SLAP means. Thank you, George Balbona. Strategic lawsuits against public participation. Absolutely, absolutely. We have another question. This is from NLA, and it's just following up. Are others encountering Zoom public meetings where reporters and the public are muted? And is there any advice other than calling out these officials? Has anyone run into that?
We have seen a species of that. So in California, the public is entitled to directly address the legislative body during public comment session, the section of the meeting. That doesn't necessarily mean that the public has a right to speak up anytime they want, and the agency could sort of tell people to quiet down during the middle of the meeting. If what the commenter is asking about is being muted during public comment, the section of the meeting, or not being allowed to make public comment during the meeting, yeah, that's problematic. And I alluded to this earlier. I think many agencies are interpreting an order that the governor of California issued a year ago as allowing them to not do live public comment. And that interpretation is wrong. California law requires live public comment to the extent it's possible. And if they are having a meeting on Zoom, it's possible. So if folks are being prevented from commenting during public comment section of the meeting, yeah, that's problematic.
Right, understood. Derek and David, how can the public, and how can, I guess, more important, journalists and journalism organizations better support the work that you are doing?
One thing I just wanted to mention on the Zoom question. So Zoom meetings, the chat function, meeting minutes, those are all public records in most interpretations at the state level. So, usually those recordings are held. We've fought for them in Illinois with the Illinois Department of Public Health, fought for the meeting minutes, which they've deemed for official use only and confidential. So just asking for those and the chat functions and text messages, et cetera. With respect with, so you remind me how local newsrooms can get involved in
and support the work you were doing, local newsrooms, but also journalists who are on their own.
Collaboration. The ProPublica has done a great job of working with not just local newsrooms, but also independent journalists in a few places to elevate their stories and get them out there and more exposure. But collaboration is key. A lot of places that we've reached out to initially are a little hesitant because they say, oh, that's competitive. Have you given this to our local public radio or TV beforehand, or is this already proactively disclosed on your site? We want it exclusively, et cetera. That old world thinking runs counter to some of the key ideas of behind public records, which is to make it accessible and open to everyone. So really impressing on people that collaboration can be mutually beneficial and usually leads to stories and projects and things that will cut through a lot of the noise.
Right. And I just want everyone to know that you have posted the website for anyone interested in some ways to get involved in your pandemic coverage areas. And it is documentingcovid19.io. Right.
What about all the closed offices and closed phone lines where nobody's answering from government, even ordinary citizen requests?
Well, that's as old as test of time, but you know, public records are you know, one sort of branch of this, right? I mean, sourcing is another component, and usually when there's, you know, bad behavior on the phone, we get a lot of emails and texts where, you know, they want to avoid disclosure, so they go call me back on the phone and we'll discuss or IRL. When you're running into that and blatant obfuscation of important sort of public health or policy decisions, papering or triangulating your request to multiple different areas is valuable, because that way you're not only going after this one person that they may have had a one-to-one communication, you're going after everyone in their network or their link analysis that they may have talked to or dealt with. And that's a good way of figuring out what they're doing and if anything's amiss.
David, can you talk about just how best to support the work you're doing, how best we all can support the work you're doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so we are here to support the public and journalists in their pursuit of public records. And the way that you all can support us at the most fundamental level is engage with us. Sign up for our email newsletter. Consider making a contribution. Join us as a free member. And that puts you in our network. There's strength in numbers. The more people we reach, the more power we have, and the bigger difference that we can make, both at the legislature and in the court system. Our organization has grown quite a bit over the last several years, and so the impact that we're able to have is greater. We're having a greater impact in court and in the legislature and more broadly. So I would say engage with us. Use our resources, our free resources. They're plentiful on our website, and ask questions. And we will do our best to get back as quickly as we can. We've been really flooded with hotline queries over the last, really year. And so sometimes it takes a little while for us to get back, but we do so as quickly as we can.
Right, thank you. And the website of your organization is firstamendmentcoalition.org.
That's correct.
That's correct. Good. It's really tiny type, but
yeah, it's a lot of letters.
Yeah, it's a lot of letters. We are going to wrap up, and I really want to thank everyone who participated and came to listen to just the valuable information that David Snyder, Andrea Gallo, and Derek Kravitz had to impart. And I really encourage everyone to go from outraged, I hope I'm not the only one who's angry, to inspired, to follow in their footsteps, to join their organizations, support their organizations, and also reach out to the people on behalf of whom we are working, our readers, our viewers. I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you very much.
Nancy, we want to thank you so much.
Oh, you bet.
Wonderful session.
I loved it. Enjoyed it.
That's great. Thank you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.